The will was 2 pages long, and it took the attorney 11 minutes to read it. When he finished, James Collar was 31 years old, and he owned a broken Massey Ferguson 590, 420 acres of corn and soybean ground in Warren County, Indiana, and $14,200 in outstanding debt split across 3 creditors. Equipment note with 6 payments remaining, a land improvement loan that had been taken out to tile a field in 1989, and a balance on a parts account at the co-op that his father had been paying down $20 at a time since 1991. His father Harold had died in March of 1993, a Wednesday morning, of a stroke that came without warning while he was doing the preseason inspection on the Massey Ferguson. Harold had been 64 years old. He had been farming since 1957. He had farmed the way men of his generation farmed when they had modest ground and modest means, and no particular belief that either condition was going to change dramatically, carefully, without waste, with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the margin between a farm that works and a farm that doesn't is thinner than it looks from outside. He had not been a successful farmer in any sense that the agricultural press of the 1970s and 1980s would have recognized. He had not expanded aggressively. He had not leveraged land appreciation to finance equipment. He had not grown beyond what his labor and his cash flow could honestly support. He had farmed 420 acres with aging equipment and made his payments and maintained his fences and kept his books in a ledger on the kitchen shelf and died with $14,000 in debt, which in 1993 was not a catastrophe but was also not nothing. James sat in the attorney's office and looked at the 2 pages of the will and the summary of the estate that the attorney had prepared and understood that what his father had left him was not wealth. It was not debt either, not in the way that debt becomes a crisis. It was a situation with a broken tractor and 400 acres and $14,000 owed to 3 people and no particular instruction for how to proceed. His father had not left a note. Harold Collar was not a man who left notes. He was a man who left a tractor that needed work in a shed and ground that needed farming, and the expectation unspoken, because everything important to Harold was unspoken, that the person inheriting the situation would figure out what the situation required. James drove home from the attorney's office and went directly to the equipment shed and opened the hood of the Massey Ferguson 590. The 590 had been Harold's tractor since 1978, bought used at a farm sale for $6,000 when it had 4,000 hours on it. By March of 1993, it had 11,800 hours. It had been Harold's primary machine for 15 years, planting, tillage, harvest support, whatever the season required. It had been maintained the way Harold maintained everything, which was to say consistently and without excess. Oil changed on schedule, filters replaced when the hours said to replace them, nothing deferred that couldn't be deferred safely, and nothing upgraded that didn't need upgrading. What had failed was the injection pump. Harold had been in the middle of the preseason inspection. James reconstructed this later from the position of the tools on the workbench and the state of the engine when the stroke had taken him. The injection pump had been on his list that morning. He had the rebuild kit on the workbench, still in its package. He had not opened it. James opened it. He spent the afternoon reading the service manual section on injection pump service. He had done this kind of work before, alongside his father, but not alone, and not with the specific pressure of knowing that the tractor needed to be in the field in 3 weeks, and he was the only person who was going to put it there. He rebuilt the injection pump over 2 days. He followed the service manual precisely, with the focused attention of someone who understands that this is not the moment for improvisation. He reinstalled it on a Friday afternoon. He started the engine. It ran. He sat in the shed with the engine idling and understood, in the specific way that a person understands something when they have done it rather than been told it, that the tractor was his now in a way that it had not been when he inherited it. He had put his own work into it. That was the difference. He went inside and called his mother, who had moved to her sister's house in Crawfordsville after the funeral. He told her the tractor was running. She said Harold would have been pleased. James said he thought so too. He had 3 weeks before planting. He spent them working through the preseason inspection list his father had started, checking everything, noting what needed attention, addressing what he could address, and scheduling what he couldn't. When the ground was ready in mid-April, the Massey Ferguson 590 was ready with it. He planted 420 acres that spring, alone, on a schedule that ran from before sunrise to after dark on the days when the weather cooperated. He finished on May 3rd. The planting was done. The $14,200 in debt was not an emergency. It was a presence, something that had to be accounted for in every decision James made about the operation across the following years, a weight that shaped choices without crushing them. He paid the equipment note first because it was the largest single obligation and because equipment notes carry the specific risk of repossession if they go current. He made the final payment in November of 1993, 7 months after Harold's death, using the proceeds from the fall harvest, combined with a careful reduction of his personal expenses that he did not discuss with anyone because it was not anyone else's business. He paid the land improvement loan through 1994 and 1995 in the way it had been structured, monthly installments that the original loan terms required. The field that the tiling served produced better drainage than the surrounding ground and had been yielding measurably better since 1989. James watched this with the attention of someone who had inherited a decision and was evaluating whether it had been the right one. By 1995, he had concluded it had been. The tiling had been worth the loan. The co-op balance he paid in full in February of 1994, 22 months ahead of the pace Harold had been keeping. He walked into the co-op on a Thursday morning and paid the remaining balance and asked for a receipt and put the receipt in the farm file where he kept financial records. He did not tell anyone he had paid it. But the co-op manager, a man named Walt Sheridan, who had known Harold for 30 years, shook his hand and said, "Your father was a good man." James said he was. Walt said, "I expect you will be too." James said he intended to try. By the spring of 1994, the estate was free of all inherited debt. James Collar was 32 years old, and he owed nothing and had 420 acres and a Massey Ferguson 590 with 12,000 hours on it and the ledger on the kitchen shelf that Harold had kept since 1971, updated now in James's own handwriting. He opened the ledger to a new page. He wrote the date, April 1994, and the balance, 0, and the note, all inherited debt cleared. Then he put the ledger back on the shelf and went out to check the soil temperature in the south field. The years that followed were the years of a farm finding its level under new management. James farmed the way his father had farmed, which was to say carefully, without the expansion ambition that the agricultural press of the 1990s promoted, and without the equipment upgrade cycle that dealer financing made easy and cash flow analysis made dangerous. He maintained the Massey Ferguson 590 the way Harold had maintained it. Oil on schedule, filters when the hours required, nothing deferred that the deferral would cost more than the doing. He added 80 acres in 1997. A neighboring parcel had come available when the family that owned it decided to sell, and the price was right in the way that prices are right when the seller needs to complete the transaction and the buyer has the cash reserve to complete it without financing. James had the cash reserve because he had been building it since 1994 with the specific intention of being able to move when something was priced correctly. He paid for the 80 acres without a loan. Doug Winters bought a new John Deere 8400 that same fall, financed over 6 years. His operation expanded through the late 1990s on borrowed capital, reached 1,400 acres by 2003, and then contracted sharply during the farm credit tightening of 2008 and 2009. By 2011, Doug was farming 900 acres on a payment schedule that required commodity prices to stay within a range the market did not always deliver. He was still farming in 2012, but the margin was thin in a way that James's margin was not, because James's fixed costs did not include debt service, and Doug's did. James did not observe this with satisfaction. He observed it the way he observed everything about his operating environment. As information, relevant to his own decisions, filed in the part of his accounting that tracked the relationship between choices and consequences across years long enough for the relationship to become clear. In 1998, the Massey Ferguson 590 crossed 14,000 hours. James had the engine inspected at a shop in Attica whose mechanic had been working on Massey Ferguson equipment for 22 years. The mechanic pulled the valve cover, checked the rocker arms, looked at the injectors, and said the engine was running cleaner than most machines he saw at half that count. He asked what James had been doing. James said he'd been changing the oil every 100 hours since he inherited the machine in 1993. The mechanic said that explained it. James said his father had done the same for the 15 years before that. The mechanic said, "That's 29 years of correct maintenance. No wonder it's clean." James said, 29 years of my father and 5 of mine. The mechanic said, "Same result either way." James drove home and noted the inspection result in the maintenance log he had started in 1993 and updated at every service interval since. The log had been Harold's before it was his, Harold's handwriting through 1993, James's handwriting after. A continuous record across 2 ownerships and 2 decades of the same machine being maintained the same way by 2 men who approached it the same way without having explicitly discussed the approach. James bought land twice more before 2005, 120 acres in 2001, from an estate that wanted a quick sale, paid in cash. 40 acres in 2004, a corner parcel adjacent to his north field that had been farmed by a neighbor who was scaling back. He paid cash for that too, a smaller transaction that he completed in an afternoon at the attorney's office. By 2005, James Collar was farming 660 acres in Warren County, Indiana. He owned every acre without debt. He had made no equipment loans since paying off the inherited note in 1993. The Massey Ferguson 590 had been supplemented in 1999 with a used Massey Ferguson 3095 that he bought at an estate auction for $11,000, cash, and that had become his primary tractor, the 590 moving into secondary work and loader duty. His operation was not visible in the ways that successful operations are visible. He did not run new equipment, he did not farm the most acres in the county, he did not have the kind of profile that farm magazines feature, the large, modern, expanding operation that represents the direction agricultural economics is supposed to be moving. He had the kind of profile that farm magazines do not feature. A man farming 600 acres of paid-for ground with aging equipment maintained to a standard that kept it reliable, no debt service competing with his operating costs, a cash reserve that let him move when something was priced correctly. In 2006, a banker at First Warren Bank in Attica called James and asked if he would be interested in a meeting to discuss expansion opportunities. The banker said the farm economy was strong, and that interest rates were favorable, and that James's balance sheet was the kind of balance sheet that made expansion financing straightforward. James said he appreciated the call. He said he wasn't interested in expansion financing. The banker said the rates were the best they'd been in 15 years. James said the rates weren't the issue. The banker asked what the issue was. James said, "The issue is that I don't borrow money." The banker said, "Never?" James said, "Not since 1993, and that was inherited." The banker said he'd never heard that from a farmer before. James said he'd never had occasion to say it before. He thanked the banker and hung up. He noted the call in his farm journal, not because it was important, but because he noted everything, and went back to the hydraulic fitting he had been replacing on the 3095 before the phone rang. In 2012, James's son Nathan came back to the farm. Nathan was 24 years old. He had spent 2 years at Purdue studying agricultural economics and 2 more working for a farm management company in Indianapolis before deciding that the managing of other people's farms was less interesting than the farming of his own. He had come back not because the farm needed him. James was managing it correctly and efficiently and alone. But because he wanted to farm, and the farm was there, and it was his family's, and he understood at 24 something that James had understood at 31, that the farm was the thing that mattered, and that the thing that mattered was worth coming back to. James showed Nathan the ledger first, not the equipment, not the fields, not the maintenance logs, the ledger, the one Harold had started in 1971, and James had continued in 1993. 40 years of the farm's financial history in Harold's handwriting and James's, two men's records of the same operation across 2 generations. Nathan looked through it for a long time. He said, "You never borrowed." James said, "Once, 1993, inherited." Nathan said, "And you paid it off the same year." The equipment note, yes. The rest by 1994. Nathan looked at the ledger. He said, "How did you know that was the right approach?" James said, "I looked at what my father left me. He left me good ground and a tractor that worked and $14,000 owed to 3 people. And I paid the $14,000 and kept the ground and maintained the tractor. That was the approach." Nathan said, "And then?" James said, "And then I did it again, every year." "That's it?" James said, "That's all there is." Nathan worked alongside James through the 2012 and 2013 seasons, learning the operation the way James had learned his father's, through proximity, through the work itself, through the specific education of doing things alongside a person who has been doing them correctly for a long time and understands why correct matters. In 2014, James added 80 more acres, bringing his total to 740. He paid cash. In 2016, he added 160 more, the ground adjacent to his south field that had been farmed by a retiring neighbor. He paid cash. The operation reached 900 acres. Nathan was 30 years old in 2018. He had been farming full-time for 6 years. He understood the land, the equipment, and the ledger. He understood the approach, not just the surface of it, the no-debt rule, the cash purchases, the maintained equipment, but the structure underneath it, the reason the approach worked, which was that it removed the dependency on conditions outside the farmer's control. No debt meant no payment schedule. No payment schedule meant no crisis when commodity prices fell, or yields dropped, or weather did what weather does. The farm's survival was not conditional on the market cooperating. It was conditional on the work being done correctly, which was a condition James could meet. In the spring of 2019, James Kohler called his attorney. He was 57 years old. His knees had been telling him for 2 years that the physical demands of full-time farming were approaching what he could sustain, and his own accounting had been telling him, more quietly but with equal clarity, that the operation was ready to pass to the person he had been training to receive it. The transfer took 6 months to structure and execute. James retained ownership of the farmhouse and a small parcel around it. Everything else, 1,120 acres of Warren County ground, the Massey Ferguson equipment fleet, the buildings, the grain storage, transferred to Nathan Kohler in November of 2019. The debt attached to the transfer, 0. Nathan stood in the farm office on the day the transfer was complete and looked at the ledger on the shelf. Harold's handwriting, then James's, now his to continue. He looked at the bottom line of the most recent page. November 2019, 1,120 acres, 0 debt outstanding. He took the ledger down from the shelf and opened it to a new page. He wrote the date. He wrote the balance. He wrote, "Transfer complete, all accounts current." Then he put the ledger back and went out to do the preseason maintenance on the Massey Ferguson 3095, which had been James's primary tractor for 20 years and was now his. The engine had been rebuilt once in 2008. The hydraulic pump had been rebuilt in 2014. The maintenance log showed every service interval from 1999 to the present day. 20 years of James's handwriting, consistent, complete, the record of a machine that had been treated correctly across a long time. Nathan started the engine. It ran clean. He checked the oil. It was at level, clear. He checked the hydraulics, full pressure, no lag. He shut it down and greased the fittings and noted the preseason inspection in the maintenance log in his own handwriting for the first time. He thought about his grandfather Harold, who had bought a Massey Ferguson 590 in 1978 and maintained it for 15 years, and died with a preseason inspection half done on the workbench and $14,000 owed to 3 people. He thought about his father, James, who had rebuilt the injection pump and paid the debts and farmed 400 acres into 1,100 across 26 years without borrowing a dollar. He thought about the ledger on the shelf, 1971 to 2019, 3 men's handwriting, one continuous record of the same farm across 4.5 decades. The Massey Ferguson 590 that Harold bought in 1978 had been retired in 2007 at 16,000 hours. James had sold it to a farmer in Fountain County who had been looking for exactly that model for parts. The engine, original, had never been opened. The farmer had called 2 weeks after the purchase to say it was the cleanest machine he'd seen at that count. James had said he was glad to hear it. He had said his father maintained it for 15 years, and he had maintained it for 14. The farmer said, 29 years of correct maintenance. No wonder. James had said, that's the only kind there is. Nathan closed the maintenance log and put it back on the shelf beside the ledger. Outside, the November ground was going into its winter quiet. The 1,120 acres that Harold Collar could not have imagined, and James Collar had built one careful decision at a time, were waiting for the spring. The debt was 0. The ground was there, the equipment was maintained, the ledger was on the shelf. Everything Harold had intended, done the way Harold would have done it, carried forward by a son who had learned from watching and a grandson who was learning from watching him. The work would continue in the spring. It always did. It always would.